The telegram was still clutched in Eva Fletcher's gloved hand when Isaac Conroy told her the truth. She had been standing on the sun-bleached platform of the Abilene depot for exactly 4 minutes, her trunk sitting beside her like a loyal dog, her hat pinned so carefully against the Kansas wind that the effort of it all seemed a small tragedy now. The locomotive behind her was still breathing its great clouds of white steam into the August sky of 1873, and every soul on that platform was moving with purpose except for her, because she had just read the wire that changed everything. The message was from her intended. From Harold Whitmore, banker of Cincinnati, Ohio, the man to whom she had been formally promised since the previous October, the man whose photograph she had studied for 6 months until she could reconstruct the precise architecture of his side-parted hair from memory. The telegram was short, as telegrams tend to be when men choose cowardice over conversation. It read, "ARRIVED Abilene 3 days prior stop circumstances have altered stop contract dissolved stop. Do not expect MY presence AT station stop WHITMORE circumstances have altered." She read it a second time, then a third, and the words did not change or soften or arrange themselves into something kinder. She was standing alone in a town she had never visited, 700 miles from her mother's house, with $40, a trunk full of good linen, and a cooking pot that had belonged to her grandmother, and the man who was supposed to be her future had decided, at some point during the past 72 hours, that she was not worth the walk to the depot. That was when Isaac Conroy appeared at her left shoulder. He was not supposed to be there. He had come to collect a feed order for his employer's ranch, a stack of invoices folded in the breast pocket of his canvas work coat, and he had no particular reason to stop walking when he saw a woman standing very still in the center of the moving crowd. But she was standing very still, and there was something about the absolute quality of that stillness, the way she was not weeping or collapsing, but simply absorbing a blow that the rest of the world could not see, that made him stop. He was 28 years old, tall and lean in the particular way of men who do outdoor work in seasons of uncertain food, with dark eyes that had a quality of steadiness that people sometimes found uncomfortable, because it felt like being understood when you had not consented to it. He wore a battered hat and boots with one broken spur, and he had 40 cents in his pocket and absolutely no business inserting himself into a stranger's crisis. He inserted himself anyway. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you need somewhere to sit down." She looked up at him then, and he saw that she was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, and that she was operating under a ferocious act of will to keep her chin level and her expression composed, and that she was not doing so because she was cold, but because she was furious. "I need," she said, with the precision of someone choosing every word like a weapon, to find out what a woman does when the man she traveled 700 miles to marry has apparently dissolved their contract by telegram. Isaac looked at the paper in her hand. He looked at her face. He thought of at least 4 things he could say, and he selected the one that was true. "The banker's loss," he said simply. She stared at him for a moment. Then something cracked open behind her eyes, not tears, not yet, but the trembling edge of a person who has been holding themselves together by force for slightly too long, and that was how it began. 6 months before Eva Fletcher stepped off that train in Abilene, Kansas, she had been living a very specific kind of suffocating life in Cincinnati. Her father, Robert Fletcher, had been a man of moderate means, a dry goods merchant whose moderate means had declined steadily through her childhood and catastrophically through her young adulthood, until by her 24th year the Fletcher family home, a pleasant frame house on Elm Street, was mortgaged twice and hemorrhaging money with the quiet persistence of a wound that no one acknowledges out loud. Her mother, Constance Fletcher, was a practical woman in the way that people become practical when they cannot afford sentiment. She had 3 daughters and a house with 2 mortgages and a husband whose health had declined along with his business prospects, and she had decided, with the calm efficiency of someone balancing a ledger, that Eva, the eldest, would marry Harold Whitmore. Harold Whitmore was 37 years old, the senior partner of Whitmore and Associates, a bank on 4th Street that held, among other things, both of the Fletcher mortgages. He was not a cruel man. He was not even, in the conventional sense, an unkind man. He was a precise man, a calculating man, a man who saw human relationships in terms of their structural function, the way an engineer looks at a bridge. Eva was healthy, educated, attractive enough, and the daughter of a man who owed him money. She would make a reasonable wife. Their courtship, if it could be called that, consisted of 4 formal parlor visits, 1 dinner, and a letter of arrangement delivered to her father in November of 1872. Eva had not been consulted about the letter. She had been informed of its contents on a Thursday evening, and she had sat very quietly and looked at her hands, and her mother had said, "Eva, this is the sensible thing," and her father had said nothing because he was not well enough to speak much by then, and Eva had looked at the wall and thought about the word sensible and what it cost. She had agreed. She had agreed because she loved her mother and her 2 younger sisters, and because the alternative was the mortgages being called in and her family losing the house, and she was not a woman who could purchase her own freedom at that price. She had agreed, and she had written Harold Whitmore 2 careful letters, and he had written back 2 careful letters, and they had arranged that she would travel to Abilene in August of 1873, where Harold had recently established a branch office of his bank, expanding west with the cattle trade money as smart Eastern bankers were doing in those years. She had packed her trunk with the thoroughness of someone who understood they were packing their entire life into a compressed space. Her grandmother's cooking pot, her mother's Bible, her own small collection of books, 3 novels and a volume of poems that Harold Whitmore would probably consider frivolous, but she had packed them anyway as a small, private act of resistance. 2 dresses suitable for a banker's wife, her good hat. She had kissed her mother at the Cincinnati station on a Tuesday morning in August, and her mother had held her longer than either of them expected, and neither of them had cried, because crying would have made the choice harder to live with, and they both knew it. The journey by rail had taken 3 days with 2 connections, and Eva had spent those days watching the country change outside the window, watching Ohio give way to Indiana and Indiana give way to Missouri and Missouri give way to the flat, wind-scoured openness of Kansas. And she had felt, with each mile, the particular tightening of a person approaching an irreversible thing. She had not felt it with dread. She had felt it with something harder than dread, a kind of sealed determination, the emotional equivalent of buttoning your coat very tightly before walking into a storm. She had arranged her face into a shape that said capable and composed, and she had arrived in Abilene, Kansas, on the 2nd day of August, 1873, in the full heat of afternoon, and she had stepped onto the platform and collected her telegram and read it, and the storm had been waiting inside the envelope the whole time. Isaac Conroy had been working for Clive Harmon's cattle operation since the spring of 1871, which made him one of the longer-tenured hands on the Harmon spread, a ranch of considerable size about 12 miles southwest of Abilene. He had arrived in Kansas from Missouri, where he had been born and raised on a small farm that no longer existed, sold by the county after his parents died within 8 months of each other in 1869, of what the county doctor called a fever and Isaac privately thought of as exhaustion. He was not a man who talked extensively about himself, not from secretiveness exactly, but from a deep-seated habit of reserve that had developed in a childhood where being visible could be a liability. He had a younger brother named Daniel, now 19 and working a spread in Texas, and they wrote letters twice a year that said the necessary things without quite saying the essential ones. He had one close friend, a fellow ranch hand named Pete Garrett who was funny and easy, and who had been killed in a horse accident the previous spring, and whose absence was a specific shape in Isaac's daily life that he had not yet found words for. He was good at his work. He was honest in the particular, uncommon way that means honest about everything, not just money and property, but about his own limitations and failures, which he had found was rarer and more useful than the ordinary kind. He could read well, which surprised people who met him on a cattle spread, and he had opinions about what he read, which surprised them further. He was quietly, genuinely funny in the way that only very intelligent people can be, the kind of funny that catches you off guard because it doesn't announce itself. He had never been to Abilene's train depot to collect a woman. He had come for feed invoices. He still had the invoices in his pocket when he sat down beside Eva Fletcher on the platform bench and listened to the whole story, because she told it to him, not in one rush but in careful, controlled installments, the way you describe an injury when you are trying to assess its severity rather than simply react to it. "He has been here 3 days," she said. 3 days, and he did not meet the train, and he did not come to the platform, and he sent this. She held up the telegram. "He dissolved the arrangement by telegram, Mr. Conroy." "Isaac," he said. She looked at him. "We are not on a first-name basis. We are sitting on the same bench on the same platform discussing the same disaster," he said. I thought that qualified. Something shifted minutely in her expression, the first crack of something that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. "Eva," she said after a moment. "Eva," he repeated, and the way he said it was simply her name without ornamentation, as though it was a straightforward fact about the world. She found to her slight bewilderment that she did not mind. "I have $40, she said. "I do not know anyone in this town. I do not know the town. I do not have a letter of employment or a reference or a plan because my plan was Harold Whitmore." Isaac thought for a moment. He thought about what he knew, which was that Abilene in 1873 was a town in the process of chaotic transition. The cattle trade had been booming for 5 years, and the respectable element was beginning to push back hard against the wilder element. And there were decent people here alongside the dangerous ones. And if you knew where to go, you could find the former without encountering too much of the latter. He thought about what he had, which was a modest but reliable income, a bunk on a working ranch, and a trustworthy horse named Copper, and zero business making himself responsible for a woman he had met 12 minutes ago. He made himself responsible for her anyway. "There is a boarding house on Buckeye Street run by a woman named Martha Aldrin," he said. "She is decent and she does not ask too many questions and she does not allow trouble in her establishment. $2 a week with meals. That gets you time to think and to plan." He paused. "I can take your trunk." Eva looked at him for a long, assessing moment. She had been raised to be careful, to weigh motives, to recognize that nothing came without a cost, and she was applying all of that now to the lean, quiet man sitting beside her with the broken spur and the steady eyes. "Why?" she asked directly. He thought about it. "Because you are standing alone on a platform 700 miles from home because a man made a promise and did not keep it," he said. "And I do not like that. It strikes me as wrong." "You do not know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know what I see. And what I see is someone who deserves better than what just happened to them." She was silent for a moment, and the wind lifted the edge of her hat and she caught it with one hand, an automatic gesture, and the cooking pot inside her trunk made a dull sound against the brass corner fittings, and the last of the locomotive's steam dissipated into the hot August sky. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked to Martha Aldrin's boarding house on Buckeye Street, Isaac carrying her trunk on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, Eva walking beside him with her back straight and her chin at its most composed angle. And Abilene in August was loud and hot and full of the particular chaos of a cattle town at the height of its season. Drovers and gamblers and merchants and the occasional respectable family, all moving through the same packed streets in what appeared from a distance to be democracy, but was in practice a very strict social topography that Eva was already, with her sharp, assessing eyes, beginning to map. Martha Aldrin turned out to be a stout woman of 50 with iron-gray hair and a face that had learned to read people quickly and accurately. She looked at Eva, she looked at Isaac, she looked at them together. "Room's clean," she said. $2 a week. Church on Sunday is not required, but I appreciate it. Supper at 6. No gentlemen callers after 8. "Yes, ma'am," said Eva. Martha looked at Isaac. "You finally bringing someone home, Conroy?" "I met her at the train," he said. "So you did," said Martha, with a look that said she had processed this information and found it interesting. And then she showed Eva to her room and left Isaac standing in the front hallway with the empty air and the invoices still in his pocket, which he had completely forgotten until this moment. He went to collect the feed order. He thought about Eva Fletcher's eyes and the way she had said the word sensible and what it costs while he negotiated pricing at the mercantile, and he made at least 2 small errors in his arithmetic, which was unusual for him. Eva's first week in Abilene was a masterclass in practical reinvention. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be paralyzed, a quality that had been both a strength and a burden her whole life, and she applied it now with determination. On her first full day, she went to the mercantile and spoke with the owner, a man named Grady, about whether he needed any bookkeeping assistance. He did not. She went to the post office and spoke with the postmaster. She went to the small dress shop on Texas Street and spoke with the proprietress, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Dunham, who looked at Eva's neat stitching on her own dress cuffs and offered her piecework at 25 cents per finished garment. It was not a fortune. It was a start. She wrote to her mother on her second day, a careful letter that described the boarding house and Martha Aldrin's cooking and the curious energy of a Kansas cattle town, and said nothing about Harold Whitmore except that the arrangement had not proceeded as expected, and that she was managing, and that they should not worry. She sealed the envelope and carried it to the post office, and felt the familiar weight of being the person in her family who managed things, the person who absorbed the hard truths and returned only the softened versions to the people she loved. On her 4th day in Abilene, she ran into Harold Whitmore. She had not been looking for him. She had, in fact, been engaged in the active task of not thinking about him, which she had been managing reasonably well, and she was walking back from Mrs. Dunham's dress shop with a paper package of fabric pieces under her arm when she rounded a corner on Cedar Street and found herself 4 feet away from the man whose photograph she had studied for 6 months. He was taller than the photograph suggested, and thinner, with pale eyes and the kind of careful, composed face that suggested the interior was equally orderly and equally empty. He was with another man, a business associate by the look of the suit, and he saw Eva a fraction of a second after she saw him. There was a moment, a distinct, suspended moment, during which Harold Whitmore could have chosen dignity. He could have chosen courtesy or even simple, basic decency. He could have approached her and offered an explanation or an apology or anything that acknowledged the magnitude of what he had done to her life. He chose none of those things. He looked at her, and something moved behind his pale eyes, not guilt exactly, more like the expression of a man who has encountered a mildly inconvenient administrative detail, and then he looked deliberately away and continued his conversation. Eva stood still for precisely 3 seconds. Then she walked past him without changing her pace or her expression, and she did not stop until she was half a block away, in the narrow space between the post office and the hardware store, where she put her back against the wall and breathed carefully through her nose and stared at the blue Kansas sky above the roofline and felt the full force of what it meant to have been discarded by a man who could not even be bothered to invent a polite fiction about it. She was still standing there when Isaac found her. He had been on his way to the mercantile again, a return trip to correct one of the arithmetic errors, and he almost missed her in the shadow of the buildings, but he had, over the past 4 days, developed an inconvenient habit of noticing Eva Fletcher when she was in his field of vision, and he stopped. "You saw him," he said. "It was not a question." "He looked through me," she said, and her voice was very level. "He looked directly at me and then looked through me as though I were a window." Isaac said nothing for a moment, because what he wanted to say and what it would be appropriate to say were in significant conflict, and he was working to resolve that tension. What he wanted to say had several elements that were neither socially appropriate nor particularly useful, and most of them involved Harold Whitmore's character in terms that were not complimentary. "He is a fool," he said at last, which was the compressed, printable version. Eva looked at him. "That does not especially help me." "No," he agreed. "It does not. Is there something that would?" She was quiet for a moment. The cattle town moved past the mouth of the alley, its noise and color and persistent animal smell, the particular wild American symphony of it, and Eva looked at it with the eyes of someone who was beginning, reluctantly, to find it interesting. "Tell me about this place," she said. "Tell me what it actually is, not what a banker from Cincinnati would see it as." So he did. They walked, and he talked about Abilene the way someone talks about a place they understand rather than judge. The cattle trade and how it worked. The Kishom Trail that brought the Longhorns up from Texas and created the whole booming, temporary economy of the town. The way the respectable citizens and the rougher element coexisted in a state of constant low-grade tension that had been escalating for years. He told her about Harmon's Ranch and how it operated, about the particular democracy of ranch work, where what mattered was whether you could do your job. She listened the way she did everything, with complete focused attention, asking precise questions that told him she was genuinely building a mental model of the place rather than simply being polite. She asked about law and land ownership. She asked about the rights women held in Kansas, which were not vast but were better in some respects than in Ohio. She asked about opportunities for employment. "You are planning to stay," he said, realizing it as he said it. "I have no money to go back," she said practically. "And even if I did," she paused, and something complicated moved across her face, "I am not certain I want to. Cincinnati is a house with 2 mortgages and a mother who loves me and sees no future for me beyond a well-managed marriage. At least here." She looked around at the busy, improbable Kansas street. "The terms are unclear. Unclear terms at least leave room." "Room for what?" he asked. She looked at him with those autumn water eyes and said, "I do not know yet. That is precisely the point." Isaac Conroy went back to the ranch that evening with a feeling he had not experienced in some years, the feeling of a life that was about to change direction, and he was not certain whether that was a good thing or a terrifying one, and he suspected, quite strongly, that it was both. He came to town the following Saturday with no particular errand, which he did not examine too closely as an impulse. Eva was at Martha Aldrin's kitchen table when he arrived, doing figures by lamplight with the focused intensity of someone completing a puzzle, and Martha looked up from her bread dough and smiled the particular smile of a woman who has been expecting something and is pleased to find herself right. "I brought you something," Isaac said, and held out a book. Eva looked up. The book was a volume about Kansas history, the kind of practical, factual text that might have been dry in other hands, but he had chosen it because she was a person who gathered information like a tool, and he had known she would find it useful, and she did. She could see that immediately from the table of contents. She looked at it and then at him. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was Eva Fletcher and directness was as native to her as breathing, "Why do you keep coming back?" Isaac sat down at the kitchen table because Martha had indicated with a slight nod toward the chair that he should, and he thought about how to answer this. "Because I want to," he said. "That is not an explanation," she said. "That is just a restatement." "All right." He turned his hat in his hands. "Because you are the most interesting person I have encountered in 2 years in this town, and because you deserve someone in your corner while you figure out what comes next, and because I find I would like to be that person if you will allow it." She looked at him for a long time. The lamplight made the kitchen warm and gold, and outside the August wind was doing what August wind does in Kansas, which is insist on itself, and Martha had gone very quiet over her bread dough. "I am not looking for another arrangement," Eva said carefully. "I know. I'm specifically not interested in being anyone's solution to anything. I know that too, and I am still extremely angry at a man who is not you, which is probably not ideal conditions for." She paused, appearing to be selecting her next word with some precision. "Anything. I understand all of that," he said. "I am not proposing an arrangement. I am proposing a friendship, which is a different thing entirely." She looked at him again. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes, and she thought about the platform and the broken spur and the absolute straightforwardness of him, the way he had said the banker's loss as if it were simply the plainest fact in the world, and she thought about 700 miles and a telegram and a man who had looked through her like a window. "All right," she said. "A friendship." "A friendship," he agreed. Martha turned back to her bread dough and said absolutely nothing, which was, Isaac thought, a considerable act of restraint on her part. The weeks that followed were, Eva would later think, among the most unexpectedly alive she had ever been. She built her Abilene life with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. The piecework at Mrs. Dunham's dress shop became a more substantial arrangement when Mrs. Dunham discovered that Eva could also do alterations and repairs with a precision that her previous help had not managed. 2 weeks after that, Grady at the Mercantile, who had initially had no need of bookkeeping help, discovered that his bookkeeping had been producing errors at a rate that was causing him quiet distress, and Eva's reputation for precise figures had traveled the short distance between businesses, and she found herself spending 3 mornings a week over his accounts. By the end of her first month, she was earning enough to sustain herself at Martha's with a small reserve growing weekly, and the particular satisfaction of it, of money earned by her own capacity rather than promised by someone else's arrangement, was a pleasure she had not expected to be so deep. Isaac came to town every Saturday. He came with no elaborate pretexts. Sometimes he had genuine errands. Sometimes he simply came, and the honesty of that simplicity was something Eva found increasingly difficult to resist finding deeply appealing. They talked. This sounds like a small thing, but it was not. Isaac Conroy talked to her about the real things in his life, about the ranch and the work and the beauty and brutality of the open plains, about his dead parents and his distant brother and his late friend Pete Garrett, about whom he spoke with the careful precision of someone who is still learning to carry a grief. He talked about his reading, which was wide and genuine, and his opinions, which were considered, and his doubts, which he did not hide from her in the way that many men hide their doubts from women, as though doubt were a weakness rather than a form of intelligence. And she talked. She talked about Cincinnati and her mother, and the freight of being the eldest daughter in a family that is sliding toward disaster. She talked about the books she loved and why. She talked about the word sensible and how it had been used on her, and Isaac listened to this with the expression of someone receiving important information, taking it in fully, understanding what it cost to say it. One Saturday in September, he asked her if she wanted to see the ranch. "On what basis?" she asked. "On the basis that you have been building a picture of this place and this life for 2 months, he said, "and I think seeing more of it would serve you. And on the basis that it would please me to show it to you, which I recognize is a secondary consideration." She looked at him with something that had been building for weeks in the very back of her autumn water eyes. "All right," she said. The ride out to Harmon's ranch took the better part of 2 hours, Eva on a borrowed sorrel mare that she handled with confident competence that surprised him, until he remembered that she had grown up in a time and place where riding was a practical skill rather than an affectation. The Kansas plains in September were a different creature than in August. The brutal heat had broken slightly, and the tall grass was beginning to take on its late summer bronze, And the sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists in large, flat places where there is enough sky to contain the full spectacle of it. Eva was quiet for much of the ride, but it was a full quiet rather than an empty one, the quiet of someone absorbing a place into themselves. She looked at everything. She looked at the way the grass moved in the wind like something alive and purposeful. She looked at the distant smudges of cattle on the horizon. She looked at Isaac on his horse, Copper, and at the easy authority of him in that context, the way the landscape seemed to make more sense of him than the town did. "You love it," she said. He glanced at her. "The plains. This life out here, the open of it." He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "I did not expect to. I came because the work was here, but yes," he paused. "Is that a strange thing for someone to love?" "No," she said. "It is an honest thing. I think that is better than a sensible thing." He looked at her for a moment and felt something move in his chest with the unhurried certainty of a geological shift, slow and total and permanent. The ranch was a working operation of the serious kind, not a romantic notion of cattle ranching, but the real, exhausting, demanding version, with its smells and its noise and its constant practical problems. Clive Harmond was a taciturn man of 60 who ran his operation with the efficiency of someone who has no patience for anything that does not serve a function, and he looked at Eva with an assessing eye that she met with complete equanimity. "Conroy's told me about your situation," Harmon said. "Has he?" said Eva with a swift glance at Isaac. "He told me you're handy with figures," Harmon said. "I've been needing someone to go over the stock records. They're a mess. My wife used to manage the accounts, but she passed 3 years ago and I've been letting it go, which is costing me money I can't see precisely where." Eva considered him. "What are you offering for that work?" Harmon named a figure. Eva named a higher one. They settled in the middle, and Isaac stood slightly off to one side with an expression that he was keeping carefully neutral, which was its own kind of expression. After Harmon went back inside, Eva turned to Isaac. "You arranged that." "I mentioned your skills in passing," he said. "You arranged it." A pause. "Yes," he admitted, "but only because it seemed like something you would want if it were offered honestly. I did not present it as anything other than what it was. I would not do that to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was warm and the ranch was busy around them, and a cow was making its opinion known from somewhere behind the barn, and Eva Fletcher stood in the middle of it with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted and her expression doing something complicated. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. I want to be clear about something." "All right. I am not a problem to be solved, and I am not a project, and I am not someone who needs to be quietly managed toward a safe outcome." She paused. "But I am someone who notices when a person does a kind thing from a genuinely good place and makes no claim on it, and I noticed that about you, and I wanted to say it." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. They rode back to Abilene in the golden late afternoon light with an inch of additional space between them and an entirely changed quality to the air. October arrived, and with it the beginning of the end of Abilene's cattle season. The drives wound down in autumn, the drovers drifted south, and the town took a long, settling breath and became something closer to a permanent place than the wild, seasonal carnival it had been all summer. The streets were quieter, the saloons were less explosive. The good citizens, emboldened by the departing chaos, began making more aggressive moves toward the kind of established, respectable community they intended Abilene to become. Isaac rode to town more often in October. He told himself it was because the ranch work was lighter. This was true, but it was not the reason, and he knew it, and he suspected that Martha Aldrin knew it, and he was fairly certain Eva knew it too. He had begun to understand, with the particular self-awareness of a careful man who has been avoiding a truth he can see clearly, that what he felt for Eva Fletcher was not friendship, or not only friendship, had not been only friendship for some time. It was something older and more serious, something that showed up in the specific quality of his attention when she spoke, and in the fact that he had read 2 books she recommended specifically so he could hear what she thought about them. and in the way every Saturday morning, he woke up with an anticipatory quality to his mood that had nothing to do with feed orders. And Eva was not unaware of him. That much had been clear to her for weeks, which she had observed with the same precise attention she brought to everything, and which she had not acted upon, because she was being careful. Because the last man who had made her feel secure had dissolved the arrangement by telegram. Because she had come this far on her own terms, and she did not intend to trade one form of dependence for another. But October was also the month that Harold Whitmore came back. He appeared at Grady's Mercantile on a Tuesday morning while Eva was in the back office with the account books, and she heard his voice before she saw him, that particular Cincinnati precision in his vowels, and she put down her pen and took one very deliberate breath and went out front. "Miss Fletcher," he said, with the tone of a man who has prepared a speech. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. The speech, it turned out, was not an apology. It was a proposal. Harold Whitmore had calculated, in the weeks since his telegram, that Eva Fletcher had not simply evaporated as inconveniently as he had hoped, but had instead established herself with annoying permanence in his new business territory, and furthermore that she was now managing the accounts for both Grady's Mercantile and Harmon's cattle operation, which gave her a social and economic presence that he had not anticipated, and which created an awkward visibility for his own behavior. He wanted, he explained with careful precision, to revisit the arrangement. Eva let him finish. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her chin level and let him say the whole thing, and then she said, "No," he blinked. "I think if you consider the practical, I have considered the practical extensively," she said. "I have been managing practical for my entire life. The answer is no, Mr. Whitmore. Miss Fletcher, you are a woman alone in a cattle town with limited. I have income," she said. "I have employment. I have a place to live and people I trust. I have $47.30 in a savings account at the other bank." She paused deliberately. "I have everything I need, and none of it requires you." Harold Whitmore looked at her with those pale, orderly eyes, and something moved in them that was not quite anger and not quite understanding, and was probably the first time in his life he had encountered a woman who had done the arithmetic on herself and come up with a different answer than the one he expected. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore," she said, and went back to the account books. She told Isaac about it on Saturday, and he listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was one of the things about him. And when she finished, he looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "How do you feel?" "As though something that was lodged in my chest has moved," she said. "Like a stone that was sitting wrong and has finally shifted." He nodded slowly. "Isaac," she said, "yes. I want to ask you something direct, and I want a direct answer." He set down his coffee cup on Martha's kitchen table and gave her his full attention, which she had the impression was total and undivided when he offered it, which was not always a comfortable experience. "What is it that you want?" she said. "From this? From me? From the direction we seem to be moving?" She paused. "I am not asking because I am uncertain of my own feelings. I am asking because I will not enter another situation where the terms are decided by someone else and communicated to me after the fact." The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which is a considerable length of time for a silence. "I want to court you," he said, "properly and openly, not as an arrangement and not as a transaction. I want to take you for rides on Sunday afternoons and bring you books and argue with you about what is in them. And I want to know what you think about everything, which I already do. But I want to do it with the explicit understanding that I am doing it because I am in love with you, and hope that you might come to feel the same." He said this with the same quality of simplicity that he brought to everything, without decoration, without performance, and Eva Fletcher looked at him for a long moment and felt the stone in her chest not just shift but dissolve entirely. "I already feel the same," she said. "I have felt the same since approximately mid-September. I was waiting for you to say it." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, an expression that was simple and open and younger than his usual guarded quality, and she thought it was probably the most honest face she had ever seen on a person. "Why did you wait?" he said. "Because I needed to know you would say it yourself," she said. "Without me creating the conditions for it, I needed it to be your own idea." He understood that completely. "It was my own idea from the first day," he said. "I was just being careful." "So was I," she said. "We are apparently both very careful people." "We are," he agreed. "Perhaps we could be careful together." Martha Aldrin, who had been present in the kitchen for this entire conversation, while doing an elaborate and wholly unnecessary reorganization of her pantry shelves, said nothing, which cost her a great deal. The courtship that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced or imagined, which was probably its great merit. They rode together on Sunday afternoons through the October and November plains, the grass deepening from bronze to tawny as the season changed, the sky huge and clean above them, talking about everything. Eva had strong opinions about Dickens, which she expressed with the conviction of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly. Isaac had strong opinions about land ownership and frontier law, which surprised her with their nuance and depth. They argued about these things with the pleasure of two people who have found a mind they can push against and be pushed back by. He was honest with her about his life in ways that cost him something. He told her about his parents' deaths, not just the facts but the particular texture of grief, the farm sold and the childhood landscape erased within a year. He told her about Pete Garrett and the accident, the way he still sometimes started to think of something he wanted to tell Pete before remembering. He told her about the loneliness of the years since, the specific loneliness of a man who is surrounded by people in a bunkhouse and is alone in every way that counts. She received these things with the care they deserved. She did not minimize them or rush past them to something more comfortable. She sat with them and acknowledged them and told him her own. The weight of being the solution to her family's problem. The particular loneliness of a woman whose intelligence is treated as a pleasant surprise rather than a basic expectation. The night on the train when she had held her grandmother's cooking pot through the dark Missouri countryside and thought about what she was trading her life for. "You are not trading your life for anything now," he said one afternoon, on the plains with the November wind cold and bright around them. "No," she agreed. "I am building it." "That is different." "It is entirely different," he said, and looked at her with the simple, total attention that she had come to think of as one of the most valuable things she had ever been given. He kissed her for the first time in November, on the front porch of Martha's boarding house on a Sunday evening, with the lamp from the window making a warm square on the boards. And it was the kind of kiss that does not need to be anything dramatic, because it is already everything that matters. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart, and he held her face in both hands as though she were something he was afraid to break and also something he was certain would not break. And after a moment she laughed quietly against his mouth from pure, startled happiness. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything. I am very happy, Isaac." He looked at her in the lamplight with the young open expression that she had come to love, that honest face. "So am I," he said. "I did not know I could be this happy. I think I had forgotten it was possible." She took his hand in both of hers. "So had I," she said. "We are both apparently capable of things we forgot." He proposed to her in December. He did it without elaborate staging, because he was Isaac Conroy and elaborate staging was not in his nature, but with a quality of deliberateness that meant more than any stage set would have. They were in Grady's store of all places, Eva checking over a delivery invoice while Isaac waited, and he set down the bridle he had been examining and turned to her and said, "Eva, I would like to marry you." She looked up from the invoice. "Is that so?" "Yes," he said. "If you want to. On whatever terms feel right to you. I am not asking you to give anything up or to fit yourself into a shape I have already decided on. I am asking because I would like to share my life with you, specifically you, and because I believe you would be my partner in the fullest sense of the word, not just my wife." She put down the invoice. Grady, behind his counter, had gone very still. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, Isaac, I will marry you." She paused. The terms are that we are equal partners in everything. That is my condition." "That is not a condition," he said. "That is just what I meant when I said partner." She smiled at him, and it was a different smile than the careful, composed expression she had worn for so much of her life. It was a wide, genuine, slightly stunned smile. The smile of a woman who has arrived, after a very long and circuitous journey, at a place that is actually home. Grady behind his counter cleared his throat loudly and said, "Congratulations," with considerable feeling, and then went back to pretending to arrange tins on a shelf. They were married on the first Saturday of January, 1874, by the Methodist minister in a small ceremony attended by Martha Aldrin, Clive Harmond, a handful of ranch hands who had cleaned up with various degrees of success, Grady from the mercantile, Mrs. Dunham, who had come in a spirit of curious goodwill, and approximately a dozen residents of Abilene who had heard about the whole story and wanted to be present for the resolution of it. Eva wore her better dress with a new collar she had made herself from Mrs. Dunham's remaining good lace, and she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Martha had saved from the summer, and she walked to the front of the church on her own arm, which created a small stir among some of the older attendees and a quiet, admiring expression from Isaac. He wore his least battered coat and new boots, and stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is fully present in the moment he is in. And when Eva came down the aisle, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that total, honest attention, and she looked back at him with all of herself. And the minister, a young man newly arrived from Pennsylvania who was still adjusting to the West, said afterward that it was the most straightforward wedding he had ever performed, no nerves. No performance, just two people saying the things they meant. They said the things they meant. They promised partnership and honesty and the full weight of themselves. Eva's voice was steady and clear. Isaac's was quiet and certain. Outside afterward in the cold January air, Martha Aldrin hugged Eva with the fierceness of a woman who has no children of her own and has decided to love the people in her orbit with full force and said, "I knew from the day he brought you in with the trunk." And Eva held her back and said, "Yes, I think we all did." Isaac shook hands with Harmond, who said gruffly, "She is better at figures than anyone I have employed, Conroy, so do not let that go to waste," which was Harmond's version of a wedding toast and was received in that spirit. They moved into a small house on the edge of town that Isaac had been quietly negotiating to rent since November. A two-room frame house with a good stove and a window that looked toward the plains. And Eva hung her grandmother's cooking pot on the hook beside the stove, and set her books on the shelf and her mother's Bible on the table by the window, and stood in the middle of the two rooms and felt the specific, profound satisfaction of a space that was hers. Isaac came to stand behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him and looked at the window and the gray January light on the plains. "What do you think?" he said. "I think it is small," she said, "and I think it is ours, and those two things together are the best thing I have experienced." He pressed his mouth to her hair. She turned around and put her hands on his face and kissed him properly in their own home, with no one watching, just the two of them and the cold January light and the grandmother's cooking pot and all the terms they had chosen for themselves. She wrote to her mother that week, the full letter this time, the real one, about Isaac and the wedding and the house and the account books and everything that had happened since August. She told her mother about the telegram and Harold Whitmore and the platform, told her what she had not told her in the careful letter back in August. And she told her about Isaac, about who he was and what they were to each other, about the partnership and the honesty and the Sunday afternoon rides on the plains. Her mother wrote back in February, a letter that took 3 readings to fully absorb. Constance Fletcher said that she had been afraid, all these months, and guilty, and that she was sorry for the arrangement and for the weight she had placed on Eva's shoulders without her full consent. She said that she had, through a set of circumstances she explained in meticulous detail, managed to renegotiate the mortgages with a different bank, and that the house was no longer at risk. She said that Eva's father had rallied somewhat in the cooler autumn months and was tolerably well. And she said in the last paragraph that she was glad Eva had found a man who saw her, because that was what she had always wanted for her, even when she could not provide it. Eva read this paragraph 3 times and then folded the letter carefully and put it in the Bible and sat for a while with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the plains through the window, and was relieved deeply and completely in a way she had not known she was waiting for. She told Isaac about the letter that evening. He listened. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. I am better than all right." She paused. "I think I have spent a long time being afraid that my happiness required someone else's sacrifice. That if I chose what I wanted, something bad would happen to the people I love. And the letter says that the thing I was afraid of was already being resolved without me. Sometimes that is how it works," he said. "Sometimes," she agreed. She looked at him. "Isaac, yes. Thank you for the platform, for the bench, for the trunk and the boarding house and the book and all of it." He shook his head slightly. "You did all of it yourself. You showed up," she said. "That mattered. You kept showing up." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I will keep showing up," he said. "That is the one thing I can promise with complete certainty." "I know," she said. "That is why I married you." Spring came to the Kansas plains with the particular, unapologetic optimism that spring in flat country has, nowhere to hide, just the full force of it arriving all at once, the grass going green in what seemed like hours, the sky becoming a different and more vivid color, the smell of the air changing overnight to something that made even the most reserved people feel the possibility of things. Eva's work had expanded further. The account books for Grady and Harmon had led to a recommendation to a livestock broker on Cedar Street, and then to a second merchant, and she had begun to understand that what she was building was not just employment but a practice, a genuine bookkeeping practice in a town that was growing and needed one. She discussed this with Isaac over supper on a Thursday evening in March, the financial projections and the practical needs, and the question of whether to formalize it or continue informally. He listened, asked questions, looked over the numbers she had written and said, "This is good. This is more than good. What would you need to do it properly?" "A better desk," she said. "And possibly a sign." "Then those are the next things," he said. "In that order." The desk arrived in April, purchased from a furniture maker who had set up shop in town, and the sign went up above the house's front window, modest and clear. ECONROY, accounts and bookkeeping. The E was deliberate. They had discussed whether to use her full name or just the initials, and Eva had said she preferred E. Conroy because it was both of them in it, her initial and his name, their combined reality. Isaac had looked at the sign with an expression that made her understand, again, why she had married him. In May, Eva discovered she was pregnant. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning before church, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee cup and the May sunshine coming through the window at a flat, golden angle, and she was characteristically direct about it. "I believe I am going to have a child. I am quite certain. I expect this is relevant information for you." He had gone very still, and then he had reached across the table and taken both her hands in both of his and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that was past happiness, something deeper and quieter and more serious. "Are you well?" he said. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly. "And slightly peculiar in the mornings, but otherwise well. I'm happy about it, Isaac. I want you to know that. I am genuinely happy about it." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt him exhale, a long, slow breath that contained a great deal of something he had been holding. "I am going to be a father," he said, and the word had in his mouth the quality of something he was testing out, turning over, beginning to understand. "Yes," she said. "You are." He looked at her. "I did not think," he said quietly, "that I would have this, a family, this." "Neither did I," she said, "and yet here we are." He pulled her into his arms across the kitchen table, which was awkward in terms of furniture geometry, and wholly successful in every other respect. And she held on to him and felt his heart beating against her. And outside, the May plains were green and enormous and alive. They wrote to her mother. They wrote to Isaac's brother Daniel in Texas, a longer letter than usual, and Daniel wrote back with an enthusiasm that demonstrated he had been waiting for exactly this kind of news for years. The pregnancy was healthy and unremarkable in the way that good things often are, its goodness consisting precisely of the absence of drama. Eva continued her bookkeeping work through the summer, accommodating her expanding state with the pragmatic flexibility she brought to all logistics. Her clients, Grady and Harmond and the broker and the merchant, either did not comment on her condition or commented on it briefly and with goodwill, and work continued. Harmond, on a visit to deliver his autumn records, looked at Eva over the desk and said, without preamble, "My wife managed accounts on horseback until 2 weeks before our second boy was born." He set the records on the desk. She was more capable than anyone gave her credit for. Eva looked at him. What was her name? Clara, he said, and the word had a particular weight in his mouth. She sounds formidable, Eva said. She was, he said, and picked up his hat and left, which was Harmon's version of a great many things. The baby was born in late January of 1875, 1 year and 3 weeks after their wedding, a boy with Isaac's dark eyes and Eva's willful chin, delivered by Dr. Hennessy after a labor that was difficult in the way that first labors tend to be, long and serious, and resolved by sheer determination. Eva was, in Isaac's later account, the most focused person he had ever witnessed, which was true, and which was entirely consistent with everything he knew about her. They named him Robert James Conroy, Robert for Eva's father and James because it had been Isaac's father's middle name, and it was a name that held both their histories in it without being too heavy about it. Isaac held Robert for the first time standing by the bedroom window with the January light making the baby's face clear, and Eva watched him from the bed with a tiredness so deep it had become its own kind of peace. And Isaac said, without looking up from the baby, "He is extraordinary." "He is approximately 8 pounds and entirely unfinished," Eva said. "But yes, I agree." He looked at her then with the baby in his arms, and she saw on his face the fullness of everything, the platform and the bench and the trunk and the Sunday rides and the small house and the sign over the window, and all of it arrived at this, the two of them and this baby in January light. "Eva," he said. "I know," she said. "I know Isaac." Martha Aldrin arrived the next morning with a pot of soup and a small knitted blanket she had been making in secret since September, and held Robert with the tenderness of a woman who has been waiting her whole life to hold a child she had permission to love, and cried with a freedom that neither Isaac nor Eva had ever seen from her, and which they both found profoundly moving. "You are his honorary grandmother," Eva said firmly, "and that is not up for discussion." Martha pressed her lips together and said nothing, and held the baby more tightly. Isaac's brother Daniel came from Texas in the spring, a tall, younger version of Isaac with easier manners and the same dark eyes, and stayed for 2 weeks and played with his nephew with the uncomplicated delight of a young man who had not expected to be an uncle, and found the experience surprisingly wonderful. He and Isaac spent one long evening on the porch talking in low voices about the things brothers talk about when they finally say them, and Eva listened from inside without meaning to, and heard enough to understand that both of them were saying they were glad to still have each other, which was the essential thing. Daniel said before he left, "I did not expect her." "What?" said Isaac. "Eva, I did not expect someone like her for you. I thought you would marry someone quiet." "She is quiet," Isaac said. Daniel gave him a look. "She has opinions about Dickens and land rights and accounting principles, and she told Harmon he was underinvoicing his breeding stock by 8%. "She was right about all of those things," said Isaac. "That is what I mean by quiet. She does not make noise unnecessarily." Daniel laughed. "I like her very much," he said. "I am glad you stopped at that platform." "So am I," said Isaac. "Every day. The years that followed were the kind that fill up with the substance of a life rather than its plot. The bookkeeping practice grew until Eva had more clients than she could reasonably manage alone, and she trained a young woman named Alice Prout, 19 and newly arrived in Abilene with a head for numbers and a fierce desire to do something with it, to help her manage the overflow. She did this consciously and deliberately, because someone had given her the same opportunity, and it seemed to her that this was how useful things propagated. Abilene changed around them. The cattle drive slowed and then largely stopped as the railheads moved south and west, following the new rail lines, and the town resettled into a different, quieter identity, more agricultural, more permanent, the wild season receding into local legend. The good citizens won their long argument with the wilder element, though the victory was slower and messier than anyone who had not been present would later remember. Isaac left Harmon's employ in 1876 to lease a small piece of land south of town, a modest beginning toward owning something of their own, and the work was enormous, and the rewards were slow. But he went at it with the same steady determination he brought to everything, and Eva brought the same careful attention to the financial side of it, and it worked in the way that things work when two people are genuinely working together. Their second child was born in the autumn of 1877, another boy which surprised them both, and they named him Thomas Daniel Conroy, Daniel for Isaac's brother, and Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him. Thomas was, from his first week, a completely different creature than Robert. Where Robert had been watchful and contained, Thomas was joyful and loud, and seemed to find everything that happened in his vicinity deeply amusing. And Robert, by age 2.5, had appointed himself Thomas's guardian with a seriousness that made both his parents press their lips together to conceal how funny they found it. Eva's mother came to visit in the spring of 1878, making the long train journey from Cincinnati, with the air of a woman completing an important errand that had been delayed too long. She was smaller than Eva had remembered, or perhaps Eva had grown in some way that made the comparison different, and she held her grandsons with a careful, wondering quality, as though they were both exactly what she had hoped, and also something she did not quite have a category for. She and Isaac were careful with each other at first, then less careful, and by the end of the second week they had found a conversational ground that worked, which was practical things, the land and the accounts and what was planned, and Constance Fletcher was a practical woman, and Isaac was a practical man, and practical things, it turned out, were a perfectly good meeting place for two people who loved the same person. On her last evening, Constance took Eva's hands at the kitchen table and said, "I am sorry, Eva, for the arrangement, for placing that on you without your choice." "I know," Eva said. "Are you," her mother searched for the word, "resolved about it, about all of it?" Eva thought about this honestly because her mother was asking honestly and deserved the same. "Yes," she said at last, "because the thing you did, which was wrong, and which I know you know was wrong, led me here, and here is everything I want. So the feeling I have about it is complicated, but it ends in gratitude, which is enough for me." Her mother held her hands for a moment longer, and then pulled her into an embrace, and they held each other in the kitchen with the sleeping boys in the next room and the Kansas night outside, and let the complicated feelings be what they were and be held, and not need to be resolved into something simpler. In the summer of 1880, Isaac completed the purchase of the land he had been leasing, 22 acres of good Kansas soil with a creek and a stand of cottonwood trees, and they stood on the property line on a July afternoon with the hot wind moving the grass and both boys running ahead of them, Robert 7 and serious, Thomas 5 and yelling for no particular reason, and Eva took Isaac's hand and they looked at it together. "Ours," he said. "Ours," she confirmed. He looked at her sideways with a quality she had come to know well, the expression he wore when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," he said, "if Whitmore had shown up at the platform?" She considered this carefully. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes I think I would have married him. I think I would have been organized and capable and very lonely for the rest of my life. And I would have collected my feed order and gone back to the ranch," he said. "And that would have been the whole story," she said. "Two people who never quite became themselves because they never met each other." He looked at her for a long moment. "His loss," he said quietly, not with satisfaction or triumph, just with simple truth. "His loss," she agreed. She squeezed his hand. "Our everything." The boys had stopped running and were crouching over something in the grass, some small creature or interesting rock, their two heads bent together, Robert explaining something to Thomas in the serious, detailed way that he explained things, and Thomas listening with unusual attention, and Eva watched them and felt the full, clean weight of her life. A third child came in 1882, their daughter, and they named her Clara after Harmon's wife, a choice that made the old rancher, now 70 and retired from active work, sit silently for a moment when they told him and then say, in a voice that had something rough in it, "That is a fine name." Clara arrived with auburn hair that was clearly her mother's contribution and a ferocious will that appeared to be joint property, and Robert, now 9, received his sister with the gravity of someone taking on a serious responsibility, and Thomas, now 7, attempted to give her his best marble on day 3 of her life, which was declined on medical grounds by Eva but accepted in spirit by all parties. Martha Aldrin came to see Clara and held her for a long time, and was healthy and sturdy herself, having maintained her boarding house with the efficiency of a woman who has decided to be useful indefinitely. They built a larger house on the land in 1883, a proper house with 4 rooms and a good kitchen and a window in every room, and Eva designed the kitchen herself, with attention to where the light would come and where the work surfaces would be most useful. And when it was built, she stood in it on the first morning and cooked breakfast and felt the extraordinary, specific pleasure of a space exactly fitted to the life you have chosen. She kept the grandmother's cooking pot on the hook beside the stove, as it had been in every kitchen she had kept since Cincinnati, a continuity of the things that mattered. Isaac built her a proper desk in the room she used for her bookkeeping work, built it himself with careful joinery from good oak, and mounted it under the east-facing window so she would have morning light for the accounts, and it was, she told him, the most thoughtful thing she had owned. More than the books, he said. The books were a very close second, she admitted. He grinned at her, the slightly rare, genuine grin that she had always loved. "I will keep that in mind." Abilene by the mid-1880s was a settled, respectable, somewhat quieter place than the roaring cattle town that Eva had stepped off the train into in 1873, and the difference was interesting to her as a long-term resident rather than as a newcomer. The wildness had not disappeared exactly, it had just become more subterranean, the surface had been organized, the streets were cleaner, the good citizens had largely won, but the essential human energies that had made the place what it was were still there, still present in the people who had stayed. She thought sometimes about what she had thought on the platform, about unclear terms and the room they leave. The terms had become clear, had clarified over 10 years into something that held their shape, the partnership and the honesty and the land and the children and the desk and the cooking pot and all of it. And what she found was that the clarity had not closed anything down, had not compressed the life into something small. It had made more room, not less. Robert at 10 was reading everything he could get his hands on and had his father's quiet seriousness and his mother's precision, and had recently announced his intention to study law, an ambition that both his parents received with the straight face of people who are simultaneously proud and amused. Thomas at 8 was almost entirely a force of nature, and had his father's ease with outdoor work, and his mother's stubbornness about things he thought were wrong, which combined in interesting ways that kept everyone on their toes. Clara at 3 was showing early signs of being exactly as singular as both her parents, which was both expected and delightful. In the autumn of 1884, Eva received a letter from Alice Prout, her former assistant, now 23 and managing accounts in Wichita with a practice of her own. The letter said that she was well and that the work was good, and that she wanted Eva to know that the opportunity she had been given had mattered, and that she was passing it forward to a young woman in Wichita who had a head for numbers and a fierce desire to do something with it, and that she thought Eva would want to know that. Eva read the letter twice and then went to find Isaac, who was working in the yard, and read it to him. He listened and then said, "You are pleased." "I am very pleased," she said. "You should be," he said simply. "That is your work too." She folded the letter. "You know what I think about sometimes. Tell me." "That there is a version of my life where Harold Whitmore showed up at that platform," she said. "And I married him. And I was organized and capable and lonely. And I kept the cooking pot on the hook and the books on the shelf. And I managed everything beautifully. And I never once felt the plains in autumn or argued about Dickens with someone who argued back or heard Robert explain something to Thomas in that voice he has or held Clara the first morning or any of it." She paused. "I think about that version sometimes. And," he said, "and I am deeply, specifically grateful to Harold Whitmore for being a coward," she said, "which is a strange thing to be grateful for, but there it is." Isaac looked at her in the late autumn afternoon, the cottonwood trees behind the house gold with the season, the children's voices from inside, the house solid and warm and full of the life they had built, and he felt what he always felt when he looked at her, which was the complete, particular thing that had no simpler name than love. "Eva," he said. "Yes. From the platform to here," he said. "I would do every day of it again." She looked at him. "Every day." "Including the ones where Thomas broke the east fence 3 times in 1 week. "Every one," he said. She walked across the yard to him and put her hands on his face the way she had on their wedding night, feeling the familiar geography of him, the jaw and the temple and the particular warmth of his skin in October air, and kissed him with the same openness she had been giving him for 11 years, nothing held back, all of herself. He held her in the yard with the cottonwoods going gold above them and the house warm and full behind them, and the November wind was already in the air, and the plain stretched out in every direction under the enormous, clear Kansas sky, and every term they had ever set down together was still holding, still exactly right. Inside the house, Robert was reading. Clara was being carried around by the cook they had hired 2 years ago, and Thomas had just announced, by the sound of it, that he had found something interesting in the cellar which would need to be investigated. "Thomas," Eva said, pulling back from Isaac with a look toward the house. "I will go," he said, and squeezed her hand once before going inside. She stood for a moment in the yard in the October afternoon, and looked at the plains and the sky and the cottonwood trees and the house with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and felt the life she was living with the full, specific, conscious weight of gratitude, the kind that does not require drama to sustain itself, the kind that is simply present, like the light, like the wind, like the sound of her family inside the warm house, the cooking pot on the kitchen hook, the books on the shelf, the desk with morning light, the sign over the old window, ECONROY, replaced now by a better sign on a more established practice, but still carrying the same essential truth. The grandmother's Bible on the table, all the small, chosen continuities of a life that was hers, fully, without exception. She had come 700 miles on a promise made by someone else and arrived at a life that was entirely her own. And the man who had made it possible had done so simply by stopping on a platform and telling the truth. And the truth had been, from the very beginning, the only thing either of them had ever needed. She went inside, where her family was, where Thomas's interesting discovery in the cellar was apparently a very confused turtle, and Robert was explaining to Clara in full seriousness why turtles deserved consideration. And Isaac was in the middle of it all with the turtle in one hand and Clara's hand in the other, and the particular expression she loved most, the young open, honest face. And he looked up at her when she came in, and the look he gave her was the same one from the platform and the bench, and the kitchen table, and the wedding, and the window with the baby in January light, and every morning in between. The look that said simply, "There you are," and meant everything. "The turtle needs to go outside," she said. "I know," he said. "Thomas is negotiating. Thomas cannot negotiate his way to keeping a turtle in the cellar." "I know that too," he said, and looked at her with that grin. She shook her head, smiling, and went to hang her coat and pick up her daughter, who reached for her with the absolute confidence of a child who has never doubted her welcome. And Eva held her and looked at Isaac over Clara's auburn head, and the October light came through the windows of the house they had built, and the wind moved in the cottonwood trees outside, and the prairie ran out in all directions under the wide Kansas sky, and everything that mattered was in this room. And everything that had needed to end had ended, and everything that had needed to begin had begun, and the life that had been promised to a banker and reclaimed on a platform in August of 1873 was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was hers. It was theirs. It was complete. And in the yard, the turtle made its slow and determined way back toward the cottonwood trees, unhurried, going exactly where it meant to go. And if anyone had been watching, they might have thought there was a lesson in that, in the unhurried, purposeful movement of a thing that knows its own direction. But no one was watching because everyone was inside together, where the warmth was.